200 now, 200 local and state food policy councils. This is kind of my job these days. I've become kind of this food policy council go-to guy. So I have to keep track of these things. Now you have a new one here in San Antonio, right? What's the name of it?
It's called the Food Policy Council of San Antonio.
Clever name. Food Policy Council of San Antonio. It's about a year old or
yeah, about 2 years.
2 years old, okay. Austin has a food policy council. And these really are, it's a collection, you might say, of food system stakeholders, people who are involved in to some extent in either producing food, it might be gardening, it might be farming, distributing food, it could be restaurants, it could be retailers, it could be certainly government, health departments, social service agencies, food banks, and so forth. And often just plain folks who have a stake in the food system. They get together and they're really looking at how they can engage local government, in some cases state government, more directly to try to come up with a food system that really makes sense for them. So we've seen a significant growth in food policy councils. We're seeing so many good projects going on. I mean, where people are just taking control of their lives. People's Grocery in Oakland, California is one example. People to say, we're going to turn vacant lots into gardens. We're going to figure out a way to get and distribute our own food. We have no supermarkets in our community, and we are a very poor community, and we got to do something about it. Same thing in Detroit. People are really being empowered around food. How can they get together and use whatever resources they have available to make a difference? We're also seeing changes in people's thinking about information and their diet and health, and how they can make decisions based on information they can get. So as a result, we're beginning to see more information about calories, for instance, in chain restaurants, so that I can actually go and look at this item or a sandwich or a hamburger and decide how many calories am I going to get when I eat this. Information is power, and unfortunately, the food industry doesn't necessarily want us to get a lot of information. If we get too smart, we're going to figure out, maybe I shouldn't eat that. So government has intervened in most cases to say, we want you to provide more information to people. And all of this is, in my mind, is incredible progress. I'm excited by it. I've been very honored and pleased to be a part of bringing many of these changes about, but there's still one big thing that's nagging at me. And I'm going to illustrate with my little, I have one product. That's all I can carry around. Here it is. You can see perhaps that this is nothing more than a tube of chapstick, right? Would you read for me what's on this? What it says right here. Can you read it?
Yeah, Monsanto.
It says Monsanto. Monsanto chapstick. Now don't worry, this is not genetically modified chapstick. This is chapstick that was actually inside what remains of this backpack. This backpack was filled with all kinds of little items like this from large agribusiness corporations. The biggest names, Monsanto, Syngenta, Archer, Daniel Midland's, Cargill, little knickknacks, refrigerator magnets, pamphlets, brochures about what they do and why they are so good and why we need them so desperately. And this backpack, or actually hundreds of these backpacks, were given to the chairpeople of state legislative agriculture committees from all over the country who came to this resort in Fort McDowell, Arizona, just about a year and a half ago, for a big conference that was completely paid for by the food industry. These are the people who are charged with really making the most important policy decisions at the state level. And they were all assembled for 3 days in a really nice place. They were out there, they were encouraged to bring their spouses. They were all given this stuff. And they were kind of owned, you might say, by that industry, all as representatives for that time. And as a result 90% of our soybean acreage in genetically engineered soybeans, 60% of our cotton, 55% of our corn. These are 2008 figures, so they're a little more now. The U.S. Department of Agriculture said we now allows for genetically engineered salmon, alfalfa, and sugar beets. And regardless of what you think about it, we, the people, didn't have much say over whether or not those products were allowed. And whenever we have tried to provide for some protection, usually at the state level, protection for property owners, trying to curtail the growth, perhaps, of genetically engineered food, or at least have a good, substantive public debate over the issue, the industry has come in and stomped it, has crushed all efforts to try to make any kind of change at the state level. Monsanto has recently threatened to sue the state of Vermont that had a bill in the legislature that would require products that have genetically engineered ingredients in them to be labeled as such. Simply label it. Just label it. There's a campaign out there now. Go to justlabelit.com. But anyway, Monsanto has threatened to sue Vermont if it actually requires that genetically engineered food is labeled as such. You may have heard, you may know of other instances where the industrial food system has been very dominant. Livestock operations, factory farms, livestock feed has not antibiotics. Over 70% of the antibiotics that are used in the United States are used in livestock. It's the reason that we are developing increasing resistance to antibiotics when humans get sick. Now, the FDA has just put some guidelines on this, so there's going to be some control, but the industry fought that tooth and nail. It's part of the reason that we have increasing doses of agrochemicals, which become increasingly ineffective as we use more of them. Resistance develops among insects, or even develops among the weeds when herbicides are being used. Now, and the argument, of course, is that the industry comes back, and I don't know how many of you maybe have been to a feedlot or been seen a factory farm, whether it's beef or cattle or poultry, hogs. I have kind of gotten into a few places in a semi-undercover situation. It certainly changed my diet once I saw how those places operated and the kind of conditions that animals are subjected to, but also the pollution, groundwater runoff. I've done a lot of work in New Mexico, in the eastern part of the state, where we have a large concentration of dairy dairy farms. And it's over 2/3 of the farms are actually in violation of the environmental permits that are issued by the state that are supposed to control the release of nitrates into the water. Over 2/3 of the water in that area around those dairy farms is above the allowable limits. And it's very hard for the state to rein in those polluters. So we have some serious problems when it comes to this industry, but at the same time, the industry keeps coming back and says, you need us. You need us because you won't be able to feed a hungry world unless we're allowed to do what we want to do. Well, here's the facts. 1 billion of the Earth's population is hungry. 1 billion, another 1 billion is overweight or obese, and 1 billion is malnourished. That's almost half of the world population. So I don't think the industrial food system has earned any bragging rights. I'm not sure I'm going to follow that train, to glory based on their record so far. In America, we have 50 million American people who are hungry or food insecure. A record number of Americans are on the food stamp program, what's now called SNAP, 47 million. 23 million of us live in these so-called food deserts. And we now, interestingly, have over 200 food banks. When I started out my career in the 1970s, there were no food banks. And I was responsible for starting a food bank in Hartford, Connecticut, one of the early food banks. I don't think that this kind of growth is necessarily a study that just came out from the Center for Disease Control yesterday that said that 42% of all Americans will be obese by the year 2030. That's only, less than 20 years away. 42%, that's a very scary figure. What is the primary reason now that young Americans are rejected for military service? It's obesity. Now, I'm a big fan of world peace, and I would really like to curtail a lot of American militarism. But being too fat to fight is not the way to do it. That's where we're headed. The fast food industry is now $170 billion a year. It's a huge part of our economy. And yet the Yale University Rudd Center says that the food industry is spending over $4 billion a year just to advertise its food to kids. And that's mostly unhealthy food, fast food, sodas, and so forth. So I'm thinking about what is my power to be able to make a decision? What is my about the food I choose? What's my power as a parent to be able to steer my children away from unhealthy food, help them make the right choices? Well, if the industry is spending $4 billion a year to persuade me to buy their products, I don't think it's a fair fight. I'm up against some real stiff odds. Nobody else, from the other side, the public interest side, is spending anywhere near that kind of money to educate us about healthy eating. My estimate, based on some numbers I've seen, is probably public expenditures, taking everything together, maybe $100 million. So it's not a fair fight in that regard. Another area that we're concerned about, where food industry doesn't have a particularly good record these days, is food safety. We hear about food recalls all the time, and people are increasingly concerned about the safety of their food. And I paraphrase something that George Burns said once: "I'm old enough to remember when food was clean and sex was dirty." And I think that many of the food safety problems we have in this country are related to the type of agriculture, the type of distribution, the large factory scale operations. So these are the problems. The reason that Monsanto puts their chapstick in the backpack and gives it to all the legislative agriculture chairs in the United States is because they want to make sure they're in control. They want to make sure that citizens like you and I don't have much of a voice. I'm also concerned as well that, just to give you one example, McDonald's was in San Francisco, the city of San Francisco has prohibited the use of little toys, little premiums that McDonald's puts in some of their meals, like a Happy Meal. Has a little premium, and this is designed to lure children into the McDonald's. "Mommy, I want to get the toy." So we go there. Well, a Happy Meal isn't that happy. It has 640 calories, and a child between the age of 4 and 8 that's over half of the calories that a child between the age of 4 and 8 is supposed to have. So San Francisco, being the somewhat very wise place that it often is, said, "No, we're going to ban these toys because they in fact have the authority to do so." Well, did McDonald's act like a responsible corporate citizen? They came back and they called the city of San Francisco Board of Supervisors the food police, the food nannies, the food tyrants, the food Nazis. And they come back and criticize them. These are the duly elected officials of a city making an informed judgment about what is in the best interest of their constituents, best interest of the public. And in fact, more Americans are agreeing with this strategy. The Pew Research poll found recently, about a year ago, that 60% of Americans want government to intervene to reduce childhood obesity. That compares to only 40% 5 years ago when a similar poll was taken. So we've seen a significant growth in public interest in the question of childhood obesity and what we're eating, and we're certainly interested in having government play a more substantial role. Anyway, I think we want to begin to push this debate along. So that ethical responsibility extends not just to from being a good food consumer and making the right choice yourself. It's also about being a good food citizen. So citizenship in this regard is just as important as consumers making those individual choices. Now, at the same time, I think there's a role for, I've been a little concerned, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, I've been a little bit concerned, actually probably a lot of concern, over the direction that many food charities have been taking. Food charities are nonprofit organizations, like the ones I've run in the past, that are forced to go out there and find money from wherever they can and keep their doors open. It's a struggle. I've been there. I did it for 25 straight years. And I have nothing but respect for those who are working every day in the trenches to raise money. But increasingly, I feel they're being bought off. I have too many friends that have been receiving support from Walmart. The mayor of Atlanta proudly announced a partnership with Walmart to build a model urban farm near City Hall. An organization I have tremendous respect for, Growing Power. It's one of the nation's leading catalysts for urban agriculture. It took $1 million from Walmart. Every Walmart that I know that opens a new store hands out a lot of money to the local food bank when they're doing it. What's wrong with Walmart? Well, we can have a big debate about that, I'm sure. I'm concerned about low wages, low benefits, monopoly practices, monopsony, meaning they control the people that buy the suppliers they're buying food from. And as the New York Times reported on recently, they have a history of bribery in Mexico, at least, that they plan to get their way. They plan to open up those stores as fast as they can, and as many as they can, and they want to dominate. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I don't care how good they are or how cheap their prices are. I think we have to be careful of anybody who wants to achieve that level of domination in any walk of life. Take another charity, Save the Children. It's always been one I thought was a great organization. And up until recently, they had a campaign underway to work with states to impose sales taxes on soda and sugary soft drinks. The idea being that if the product's more expensive, I'm going to reduce my consumption, and therefore I would reduce obesity. Obesity is a major public expense. The CDC report said that obesity is costing us about $200 billion a year of additional medical costs in this country. So as a citizen, as a taxpayer, I have a real stake in reducing obesity. Well, this campaign was underway, Save the Children was supporting it, that was great. Well, the New York Times again reported that Save the Children suddenly dropped the campaign, stopped supporting this effort to impose sales taxes on soda sales. And at the same time, they reported that Save the Children had received a $5 million donation from Pepsi, and they were getting a $5 million donation from Coke. How do you make responsible decisions when you're in that kind of situation, when you're getting that kind of money to do something? It emasculates you. You've lost your power, you've lost your ability to make a choice. So, I ask people to, if you really are about ending hunger, if you want to promote urban farming, if you want to reduce obesity, shouldn't you also want to promote healthy food and economic justice? These are all the things that are important to me, and I believe they're also important to you. I'm really worried about too much influence. And my favorite Republican, I actually have a favorite Republican, people probably acknowledge, I probably wouldn't think that I have a favorite Republican, but mine was President Eisenhower. And his statement that I have nailed on my wall from his 1961 farewell address was, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex." Now, we all heard it, we didn't do much about it. But I think you could substitute for military-industrial complex the agro-industrial food complex, which has gained the same kind of influence. And this is what we have to guard Now, I keep asking people to kind of push the envelope, to kind of think outside the box, to keep challenging their own thinking and their own choices, and statements that are made by those who, maybe are well-intentioned, but aren't maybe thinking beyond their immediate needs or immediate interests. And one way I did this was just in advance of my first book, Closing the Food Gap. I was told by my publicist, this is my first book, so you gotta get out there, you gotta write stuff and get yourself in newspapers and get some editorials written and make a name for yourself, make a lot of noise. So I said, all right. So I took a part of my book and I wrote an essay and I submitted it to the Washington Post. And they liked it. And they ran it just on the Sunday before Thanksgiving. And they ran it on page 1 of the Sunday opinion section, above the fold, and it was illustrated with a loud array of Andy Warhol Campbell soup cans. And my piece really did take the nation's food banks to task for not really doing enough to try to end the hunger, for actually addressing the causes of hunger, which was poverty. And I was speaking as one who had started a food bank in Hartford in the 1980s. I said that the country's food bank staff, volunteers, and board members had become a little too comfortable with their increased growth, and that they didn't have, or they hadn't mustered the political courage to take on the cause of hunger, which was poverty. I think you can see a fairly direct relationship between income disparity in this country and how we fall behind by really important measures of quality of life. So it's all a question about where our priorities are. Where are we going to put our investments? Where are we going to try to make a difference? Are we going to address this issue as a justice issue, a social and economic justice, a justice issue? Or are we going to just continue to put Band-Aids on things? It comes down to a fairly simple choice, in my opinion. If you want to end hunger, we need to tax the wealthy. I would say we need to double the minimum wage. We need to have a living wage in this country, which probably ought to be about $15 an hour. When it comes to food, you do have to acknowledge the fact that there is this big looming question about who is going to feed the hungry world. We are expecting 9 billion people to be on the planet by the year 2050. And most agronomists and most experts say we don't have the resources worldwide to feed that many people. How are we going to do it? So, of course, the industry uses this as an opportunity to say, well, let us do it our way. More biotechnology, more factory farms. We'll work with food banks and make sure that everybody has enough food through those means. And all of this, in my mind, comes down to being a threat, ultimately, to our rights to making choices, to our ability to influence the process, to have a seat at the table, and have our voices heard. And where I always come back to on this is a quote from the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen, who spent his career studying world economies, particularly impoverished nations. He studied famine, he studied political economies. He kind of looked at history, he looked at the present, and he came up with this conclusion. He said that no nation with a functioning democracy, where there's a free press, open discourse, government accountability, in no nation like that has there ever been a famine, no matter how poor that country is, no matter how poor that country is. So in other words, where people know what's going on, where people are participating in the solutions, you're not going to find that crisis situation where people are suddenly starving to death. Now, I think there's a domestic U.S. version of that. The more of us who are participating in this discussion and who are informed and be able to actually make a difference, that collective information is power, and our voices have power, and it allows us to find and discover solutions that we wouldn't otherwise find if we allowed the food industry just to take it in whatever direction they want to go. And the last story I'm going to tell you is bring it back home at least a little bit. It's from Austin. I don't know if you know. Do you not like Austin?
It's weird.
It is weird. I go to places I'm never quite sure, sometimes people say, oh, they're doing this in Berkeley. God, people go, ugh, Berkeley. I don't know anything about that. But let me see if I, oh, here we go. As I told you before, the Happy Kitchen is this new program that takes young moms, mostly lower income moms, and gets them involved in cooking, learning how to cook, teaches them how to cook. The program is peer-led, so the people who are actually teaching are actually the same, coming out of the same backgrounds as the students themselves. Many good pieces of that program. But I tell this story about one woman I met in particular, and maybe because I'm here in a house of worship and it has a bit of a spiritual tone to it, it's the way to end this. Dorothy Morrison embodied all the hopes and challenges of the women I met in Austin. On the one hand, she fit every negative stereotype that our snarly society had dreamed up. A 37-year-old black woman who was overweight, a single mother of 5 children, ages 4 to 18, and living in public housing. On the other hand, she was a woman who was searching daily for every resource she could find to make as much success as possible from the cards that were dealt her, as well as the ones she had dealt herself. She admits her first encounter with food was a disaster. My sister and I put a whole chicken in a boiling pot of water for a couple of hours, she said. It was a mess. But Dorothy's love of cooking and her grandfather's lessons gave her some basic competency in the kitchen. Like that of so many others, however, the daily menu was heavy on fried chicken and other fatty foods, and light on fresh produce. And when she became a mother, she explained, she confessed, preparing healthy meals became a real strain. When you're stuck in an unhealthy eating habit for your whole life, she said, it's hard to make a permanent change. It takes a lot of commitment. And when you have 5 kids, all with different appetites, and I'm tired and stressed out, at the end of the day, well, they tend to get what they want. That's when it becomes all about convenience. She says one of her sons is obese, and it was partly out of concern for him that she decided to enroll in the Happy Kitchen program. They taught me how to make broccoli taste good without smothering it in cheese. Dorothy told me with a laugh. I smelled rosemary for the first time and learned to love cilantro. I discovered that I could bake chicken with herbs and it would have plenty of flavor. She was given simple ideas like the use of colors. The more variety of color on the plate, the more likely you have a balanced and healthy meal. She was introduced to a new and healthier twist on old foods like fresh tomatoes rather than canned ones. She learned how to read nutrition labels, a skill that she now practices with her children when they go grocery shopping together. I make them read the labels on cereal boxes so that we buy the ones with the lowest sugar content. She says that the Happy Kitchen gave her confidence that made her feel more positive as a mom. It empowered me, she said, to be able to make healthy dinners for my children, and seeing them start to like vegetables gave me more confidence. But she gives her spiritual partner just as much credit. I always count on the Lord to help me think clearly. Eating healthy has a lot to do with knowing God. Our body is a temple, as the saying goes. After all, God didn't make nachos. That's from her. He created fruits that grow from the trees and vegetables that grow from the ground. He created cows and chickens, but not the lard, the fried one. There was a long, almost prayerful pause and a searching glance upward. I seek the willpower to use the knowledge, and I ask for the strength and willpower to make other changes in my life. And that was fairly typical in many ways of the people I met in Austin. And I think at a personal level, that is a big part of the story. How do we make those changes, particularly when we're up against some really serious odds, not just socially and economically, but against a whole advertising system, a whole industry that doesn't want you to make those changes. And the other part of the story is about policy. How do we get more support to both push back that industry and at the same time help more people like Dorothy? As wonderful as the Happy Kitchen program serve, I think, was about 600 or 700 people a year. That's just in the city of Austin. I mean, they could easily be, it would be very helpful if they could serve tens of thousands of people in Austin every year, just like any other community in this country. Well, where do we get the resources to do that? But we have to decide what's important, right? I mean, we have to be investing in our children. We have to be, I mean, this is a legacy that really does count. In the same way that our environment is a legacy we have to protect to be able to hand on a safe and clean one to our children. And it's about choices, ultimately. It's about the responsibility that we all have to try to get on board and start to steer our food system down a different road. It's important to be a good food consumer, but please think about how you can also be